Mira Voss grew up believing that love was something you earned by staying quiet and useful. She was the daughter of a small border pack, the kind of pack that other kingdoms forgot existed until they needed extra soldiers or extra grain. Her father trained fighters. Her mother kept records. Mira herself grew up between the two, learning how to read a room before she learned how to read a book, because in a small pack, reading a room could save your life. When she turned 19, the bond hit her without warning. She was carrying water buckets from the well when she felt it, a pull in her chest, sudden and strange, like someone had tied a string around her heart and yanked. She dropped one of the buckets, water soaked into the dirt. She didn't care. She already knew, the way every wolf knows, that somewhere out there, a man had just felt the same pull. His name was Draven Cross. He was the Alpha King of the Central Crown, the strongest of the 5 kingdoms, the one every other kingdom measured itself against. Mira had seen him only once before, from a distance, at a gathering her father had been forced to attend. She remembered him as a tall shape in dark clothing, standing apart from everyone else, like the crowd itself didn't dare get too close. She never expected the bond to choose him. Small pack girls did not become queens. But the bond did not care about her father's rank or her mother's ledgers. It simply happened, the way weather happens, without asking permission. For the first few months, Draven kept his distance. He sent no letters. He made no announcement. Mira told herself this was normal. Kings were busy. Kings had wars to think about. Kings did not drop everything the moment a bond snapped into place. She waited. She practiced patience like it was a skill she could master if she just tried hard enough. Then, almost a year later, he came for her. He didn't come with flowers or soft words. He came with an escort of 12 guards and a carriage, and he told her father, in a flat voice, that she would be moving to the Central Crown Palace as his intended mate. Her father, who had spent his whole life hoping for exactly this kind of opportunity for his daughter, agreed before Mira could say a word. She told herself it didn't matter that he hadn't asked her himself. She told herself that kings didn't ask, they declared, and that the softness would come later, once he got used to having her around. She packed her things in one night and left the only home she'd ever known without looking back, because looking back felt like admitting she was afraid. The next 3 years of her life were built on that same kind of quiet hope. Draven never mistreated her, not in any way she could point to and name. He never raised his voice. He never raised a hand. But he also never really looked at her, not the way she'd imagined a mate would look at another. He spoke to her in short sentences, mostly about schedules and appearances. He asked her to attend events beside him, so the court would see them together. He never asked her what she thought about anything that mattered. Mira filled the silence herself. She learned the names of every noble family in the Central Crown. She learned which advisors could be trusted, and which ones smiled too easily. She organized the kitchens so that no one went hungry during the lean months. She sat with the palace staff during their breaks instead of eating alone in her room, because at least the staff talked to her like she was a person and not a decoration. She told herself this was enough. She told herself that some bonds took time. She told herself a lot of things, actually, mostly late at night, when the palace was quiet and the space beside her in the enormous bed she was never invited to share stayed cold and empty. There was a moment, about 2 years in, when she thought something might change. Draven had come back from a border dispute with a cut along his jaw. Nothing serious, but the healer was busy with someone else, so Mira cleaned the wound herself. Her hands shook the whole time. He sat very still and let her work, watching her face instead of the bandage. For one strange, breathless minute, she thought she saw something behind his eyes. Not love exactly, but the beginning of something. Then he thanked her, stood up, and left the room, and the moment closed like a door. She held on to that minute for a long time, longer than she should have. The accord was the event that ended everything, though nobody in that room understood it that way at first. Once every 5 years, the 5 kingdoms gathered to renew the old peace treaty that kept them from tearing each other apart. Every Alpha King attended, along with their court, their advisors, and, traditionally, their mates. It was a show as much as a meeting. Each kingdom wanted to prove it was strong, stable, and worth respecting. Mira spent weeks preparing for the accord. She had a dress made in the deep blue of the Central Crown's colors. She rehearsed the names and titles of nobles from every kingdom so she wouldn't embarrass Draven by forgetting anyone important. She practiced her posture, her smile, the exact tilt of her head that made her look composed instead of nervous. She wanted, more than anything, to make him proud in front of the other kings. Some small, stubborn part of her still believed that if she was good enough, useful enough, graceful enough, he would finally see her the way she'd always hoped. The hall where the accord took place was enormous, built from pale stone with high windows that let in long bars of afternoon light. A single long table stretched down the middle, with each kingdom's alpha seated according to old tradition. Behind each alpha stood their court. Mira stood just behind and to the side of Draven's chair, exactly where she always stood, hands folded, chin level, doing her best impression of a queen who belonged there. She noticed Ronan Blackwood the moment he walked in, though she didn't know his name yet. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Wilds, and he moved through the hall like the marble floor had personally offended him at some point, and he hadn't forgiven it yet. He didn't smile at anyone. He didn't perform the polite half-bow the other kings exchanged. He simply walked to his seat, sat down, and looked around the room like he was cataloging every weakness in it. Mira had heard stories about him, the way everyone had. The Northern Wilds and the Central Crown had fought a war 2 generations back, over land neither side had ever fully agreed belonged to the other. The war ended in an uneasy truce, not a friendship, and the 2 kingdoms had circled each other with polite hostility ever since. She'd heard Ronan Blackwood described as cold, as ruthless, as a king who cared more about his borders than his people. She had no reason to think differently. She barely thought about him at all, honestly, because her attention that day was entirely fixed on the man in front of her. The formal part of the accord went the way it always did. Old grievances were mentioned and set aside for another 5 years. Trade agreements were confirmed. Border patrols were discussed in careful diplomatic language that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Mira stood through all of it, smiling when she was supposed to smile, silent when she was supposed to be silent. Then came the tradition that made the accord more than just a treaty renewal. Each Alpha King was expected to formally present their mate to the gathered court, confirming the bond in front of witnesses from every kingdom. It was old custom, older than the accord itself, meant to prove that a king's private life was as stable and honest as his public one. Draven stood. Mira's heart did something strange and hopeful, some foolish leap she couldn't stop even after 3 years of learning better. She thought, for one bright second, that this was it, the moment he would finally say the words out loud, in front of everyone, and make real what she'd been waiting for since she was 19 years old, with a bucket of water spilling into the dirt. He didn't look at her. That was the detail she would remember for the rest of her life, longer than the words themselves. He looked at the table. He looked at the other kings. He looked anywhere except at her face. I reject Mira Voss as my mate and Luna. 4 words too many, and yet somehow the shortest sentence she'd ever heard in her life. The room did not gasp, not right away. It was too shocked for that. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise could have been. Mira felt it settle over her like snow, cold and quiet, and covering everything. She did not cry. She would think about that later, how strange it was that her body chose that exact moment to become perfectly still and perfectly calm, like it already understood something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. She looked down at the floor instead of at him, and she counted the seams in the marble. 14 of them, running in a straight line from where she stood to the great doors at the end of the hall. Somewhere behind her ribs, something that had spent 3 years reaching toward Draven Cross simply stopped reaching. She felt it happen almost physically, a thread going slack, a weight lifting that she hadn't known she was carrying until it was gone. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like grief with nowhere to go. Around her, the whispers started, the way whispers always start in rooms full of nobles who live for exactly this kind of moment. She heard fragments. Did he say, "Mount"? In front of everyone? Poor girl. But the words slid off her like rain off stone. She had one thought, clear and simple. She needed to leave this room before her legs stopped working. So she walked. She didn't run, though every instinct told her to. Running would have given the room a story to tell, a picture of a broken girl fleeing in shame. Walking, slow and steady, denied them that. She kept her chin level, the same tilt she'd practiced for weeks, and she walked the 14 seams of marble to the great doors, and she did not look back once. The last thing she heard before the doors closed behind her was Draven's voice, still flat, still calm, moving on to the next item of business, as though he hadn't just ended 3 years of her life in a single sentence. Outside the hall, the courtyard was cold and mostly empty, the afternoon light thin and gray. Mira stood there for a moment, not sure what her body was supposed to do now that it had gotten her out of the room. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold exactly, more from the strange, hollow feeling of having nowhere left to walk toward. That was when she heard footsteps behind her, deliberate and unhurried, and she turned to find Ronan Blackwood standing a few feet away. She hadn't heard him leave the hall. She realized later that he must have followed almost immediately after her, which meant he'd left in the middle of the Accord's proceedings, an act that would normally be considered a serious insult to every king in that room. At the time, she was too numb to think about what that meant. She just looked at him, this stranger with cold eyes and a colder reputation, and waited to see what he wanted. He didn't say anything comforting. He didn't offer sympathy, which she was grateful for later, because sympathy from a stranger would have broken whatever thin composure she had left. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, the way someone looks at a puzzle they're trying to solve, and then he said, "You held your face still in there." That took more strength than anyone in that hall understood. It wasn't kindness exactly. It was closer to respect, and something about that steadied her more than kindness would have. She didn't answer him. She wasn't sure her voice would work if she tried. He didn't seem to expect an answer. He simply stood there with her in the cold courtyard, not touching her, not crowding her, just present, until the doors of the hall opened again and the rest of the court began spilling out into the afternoon light, done with their business, ready to gossip about what they'd just witnessed. That was when Ronan did the thing that would change everything. He stepped forward, took her hand, not gently, not romantically, more like a man closing a deal, and turned to face the crowd pouring out of the hall. His voice carried easily across the courtyard, the voice of a king used to being heard. "Mira Voss, I claim you as my Luna." The words landed like a second earthquake in a single afternoon. The crowd that had been quietly gossiping went dead silent, then erupted into a noise Mira couldn't even separate into individual voices. Somewhere in the chaos she heard Draven's name mentioned, sharp and urgent, someone running to fetch him. Mira stood frozen, her hand still inside Ronan's, staring at him with something between shock and disbelief. She hadn't agreed to this. She hadn't even spoken to this man before today. And yet here he was, claiming her in front of 5 kingdoms worth of witnesses, as though her rejection an hour earlier had simply been an opening he'd decided to take. She should have pulled her hand away. Later, she would wonder why she didn't. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was the fact that no one had chosen her, actually chosen her, out loud and in public, in 3 long years, and some starving part of her recognized the shape of that even coming from a stranger. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe she was just too tired to fight one more thing that day. She looked down instead of at the crowd, and that was when she noticed it. The collar Ronan wore at his throat, the one marking his rank as king, had a claim thread woven through it, the old symbol kings used when formally taking a mate. The stitching was slightly crooked, off by half an inch, rushed in a way that felt strangely human for a man everyone described as cold and calculating. She stared at that crooked thread, instead of at his face, instead of at the crowd, instead of at anything else, because it was easier than looking at the wreckage of her own mourning. Draven appeared in the courtyard a moment later, And for the first time in 3 years, Mira watched something break across his composed features. He looked at her hand in Ronan's. He looked at the crowd watching them both. His jaw locked, and for one strange moment, Mira almost laughed, because the man who couldn't look at her inside the hall could not stop looking at her now. "You cannot claim what I've already rejected," Draven said, his voice low, meant for Ronan, though the whole courtyard heard it anyway. Ronan's expression didn't change. "You made it clear she was free. I'm simply telling you what I intend to do with that freedom." It wasn't romantic. Mira understood that even in the moment, even with her chest still raw from an hour-old wound, this was two kings using her like a chess piece in a game that had started 2 generations before she was born. And yet, standing there in the cold, watching Draven's composure crack for the first time she'd ever witnessed, something in her went very quiet, and very cold, and very certain. She turned to Ronan and said, in a voice steadier than she expected, "If I go with you, I go because I choose to, not because you claimed me in front of a crowd like I was a piece of land." For the first time since she'd noticed him in the hall, something shifted in Ronan's expression. Not quite a smile, but close to one, the kind of look a man gives when he's just been told something he respects more than he expected to. "Fair," he said. "Then choose." She looked back at Draven one more time. He was still watching her, jaw tight, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. 3 years ago, she would have given anything for him to look at her like that. Now the look meant nothing to her, except confirmation that she'd spent 3 years waiting for a door that was never going to open. "I choose to leave," she said, to both of them and to no one, and then she walked toward the carriages at the edge of the courtyard, and after a moment, she heard Ronan's footsteps following behind her, at a respectful distance, not crowding her, just there. The journey north took 4 days. Mira spent most of it staring out the carriage window, watching the Central Crown's gentle hills give way to the sharper, colder landscape of the northern wilds. Ronan rode alongside the carriage on horseback most of the time, rather than riding inside with her, which she was grateful for. She wasn't ready for conversation. She wasn't ready for anything, really, except silence and the steady rhythm of wheels on the road. On the second night, they stopped at a small inn along the border. Mira sat by the fire in the common room, unable to sleep, turning the day of the accord over in her mind again and again, trying to understand how her entire life had rearranged itself in the space of one afternoon. Ronan found her there, sat down across the fire without asking permission, and for a long time neither of them said anything. "You don't have to explain anything to me," he finally said. "I didn't claim you because I expect gratitude. I claimed you because it was the right move, and because I don't like watching a king humiliate someone in front of 5 kingdoms and get away with it clean." Mira studied him in the firelight. "That's not the same as caring." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. Not yet." The honesty of it startled her more than any romantic declaration could have. She'd spent 3 years with a man who never said what he meant, who let her fill every silence with her own hopeful guesses. Ronan Blackwood, whatever else he was, did not seem interested in letting her guess. "Why did you really do it?" she asked. "The claim, in front of everyone." He was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire the way she'd been staring into it before he sat down. "The Northern Wilds and the Central Crown have hated each other since before either of us was born, over a border dispute neither side even remembers the real reason for anymore. I've spent my whole reign trying to find a way to shift the balance without starting another war. Then I watched Draven Cross throw away the one thing that could have made his kingdom stronger, a mate who apparently ran his kitchens, managed his staff, and kept his court from falling apart while he stared at treaties all day. That's not sentiment. That's strategy. I'd be a fool not to take what he was foolish enough to give up." It should have stung, hearing herself described as a strategic advantage instead of a person someone wanted, but there was something almost relieving about the bluntness of it. At least he wasn't pretending. At least for the first time in 3 years, someone was telling her exactly where she stood instead of leaving her to guess and hope and wear herself thin on maybes. "And if I turn out to be a bad investment," she asked, a little dry, testing him. For the first time, he actually smiled, small and unexpected. Then I'll have made a very public, very expensive mistake, and my advisors will never let me forget it. She almost laughed. It surprised her, the sound catching in her throat, rusty from disuse. It was the first time she'd come close to laughing in longer than she wanted to admit. The Northern Wilds Palace was nothing like the Central Crown's. Where Draven's home had been all pale stone and towering ceilings designed to make visitors feel small, Ronan's palace was built into the side of a mountain, dark wood and thick stone walls meant to hold heat against brutal winters. It felt less like a display of power and more like a place built to survive. The staff there treated her with careful politeness at first, unsure what to make of the woman their king had claimed in front of 5 kingdoms, without warning anyone, including apparently themselves. Mira understood the wariness. She'd have felt the same way in their position, so she did what she always did. She found ways to be useful, quietly and without asking for permission, the same way she'd survived 3 years in a palace where no one particularly wanted her there either. She started in the kitchens, the way she always did, because kitchens were where the real information of a household lived, and because feeding people honestly was a language she understood better than court politics. Within 2 weeks, she'd learned the names of the kitchen staff, discovered that the head cook had been quietly rationing supplies out of fear rather than actual shortage, and reorganized the storerooms so that nothing sat wasting while other supplies ran short. Ronan noticed. He didn't say much about it directly, but she caught him watching her sometimes across the great hall during meals, an expression on his face she couldn't quite name, not the cold calculation she'd expected from the stories, something closer to curiosity. Their relationship in those early weeks was not romantic, not in any way Mira could have described to someone else. It was built out of small, practical exchanges. He asked her opinion on trade proposals, actually waited for her answer, actually seemed to weigh what she said, instead of just letting her talk to fill silence. She asked him questions about the Northern Wilds, about the war 2 generations back, about why a kingdom that seemed so guarded from the outside felt, once you were actually inside it, warmer than the palace she'd left behind. "My grandfather started that war," Ronan told her one evening, the 2 of them sitting in his study going over supply reports, neither of them particularly needed to review together, though they kept finding reasons to do it anyway. He believed strength meant never backing down from anything, even disputes that weren't worth the cost. "My father spent his whole reign trying to undo the damage. I've spent mine trying to make sure it never happens again. Is that why you claimed me?" she asked. Some kind of peace offering dressed up as a political move? He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "Partly, I won't pretend the political benefit didn't matter, but I also watched a man stand up in front of 5 kingdoms and reject a woman who by every account had been holding his household together for 3 years, and something about that made my blood run hot, in a way strategy alone doesn't explain." Mira didn't know what to do with that answer, so she said nothing, and he didn't push her to. The trouble started about 2 months after her arrival, the way trouble usually starts, quietly. In the corners no one is watching closely enough. Word came from a border patrol that a group of rogue wolves, unaffiliated with any of the 5 kingdoms, had been raiding small villages along the northern edge of the wilds, stealing supplies and, in a few cases, hurting the villagers who tried to stop them. Rogue attacks weren't unheard of, but the pattern of these felt organized in a way random violence usually wasn't. Ronan called a council meeting the same night the report arrived, and for the first time since her arrival, Mira was invited to sit at the table instead of standing behind it. "They're being funded," one of his advisors said, laying out reports on the table. "Small packs don't organize like this on their own. Someone is paying them, arming them, telling them where to hit." "Any idea who benefits from destabilizing our northern villages?" Ronan asked, though his tone suggested he already had a guess he didn't like. The advisor hesitated before answering. "The timing lines up with the accord, with your claim." The room went quiet. Mira felt every eye at the table shift toward her without quite looking at her directly, and she understood immediately what they were all thinking without anyone saying it out loud. "You think Draven is behind this," she said. "I think," Ronan said carefully, "that a man humiliated in front of 5 kingdoms might look for a way to remind everyone that the Central Crown is still the strongest kingdom, without technically breaking the Accord's peace terms. Rogue attacks, he can deny involvement and do exactly that." Mira felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear exactly, more like the sick recognition of a pattern. She thought about the years she'd spent in Draven's palace, watching him make careful, deniable moves against rivals, always through advisors, always through channels that let him keep his hands clean. It fit. It fit in a way that made her furious at herself for not seeing it as a warning sign years earlier. "If it's him," she said slowly, "he won't have left anything that traces back directly. He's too careful for that. But he'll have used someone close to him to arrange it. Probably Advisor Kell. He handled anything Draven didn't want his own name attached to." The table looked at her with new interest. She realized, with a strange jolt, that this was the first time in years anyone had looked at her like her knowledge actually mattered, like she was a source of real information instead of a quiet presence expected to nod along. "You know his methods that well?" Ronan asked. "I spent 3 years watching him from behind his chair," Mira said. "I know exactly how he prefers to hurt people without getting his own hands dirty." Over the following weeks, Mira worked alongside Ronan's advisors, piecing together patterns she remembered from her years in the Central Crown. Old trade routes Kell had used before, small border villages historically loyal to families with grudges against the northern wilds, the specific kind of deniable cruelty that always seemed to trace back, eventually, to Draven's careful hand. It was strange, using the years she'd spent feeling invisible and unwanted as a weapon now, turning her old pain into something useful. She and Ronan worked late most nights during that stretch, hunched over maps and reports in his study, and somewhere in those long hours, something between them shifted, quiet and gradual, the way ice thaws instead of breaks. He started asking her things that had nothing to do with strategy, what her childhood had actually been like, what she wanted for herself beyond survival, whether she'd ever wanted anything for her own sake instead of everyone else's. "I don't actually know," she admitted one night, surprised by her own honesty. "I spent so long trying to be useful enough that someone would keep me, I never really stopped to ask what I wanted separate from that." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "That's the saddest thing I've heard you say, and you've told me about the day a king rejected you in front of 5 kingdoms." She laughed, a real laugh this time, not the rusty surprise sound from the inn weeks earlier. "When you put it that way, I'm serious," he said, and his voice had lost its usual dry edge. "You deserve to want things just because you want them, not because wanting them keeps you useful to someone else." She looked at him across the map-covered table, the firelight catching the sharp lines of his face, and she realized, with a kind of quiet shock, that somewhere in the last 2 months, without either of them planning it, she had started to feel something real for this man who'd claimed her as a strategic move and then spent every day since treating her like a person worth actually knowing. The confrontation with Draven came sooner than anyone expected. He arrived at the Northern Wilds border with a small envoy, requesting formal talks under the terms of the Accord, which technically neither kingdom could refuse without violating the treaty both had signed. Ronan agreed to the meeting, though Mira could see the tension in his shoulders the whole morning before Draven's arrival, the careful control of a man who wanted very badly to do something the Accord wouldn't allow him to do. They met in the Great Hall, smaller and colder than the one where the Accord itself had taken place, though it felt, to Mira, like walking back into that exact moment all over again. Draven stood across the room, flanked by 2 advisors, Kell among them, and for the first time since the day he'd rejected her, Mira looked at him directly and felt nothing crack inside her chest at all. "I know it's you," Ronan said, without any preamble, once the formal greetings had been exchanged. "The rogue attacks on my northern villages. I know you funded them, and I know why. Draven's expression didn't shift, the same careful blankness she remembered from years of watching him across dinner tables. I have no knowledge of any rogue activity in your territory. If you have proof, present it to the Accord Council. Otherwise, this accusation is beneath a formal meeting. I have Advisor Kell's payment routes, Ronan said calmly, matched against the same routes he used 2 years ago during the trade dispute with the Eastern Vale. Mira remembered them, down to the specific villages he favors using as pass-through points, because they've been quietly loyal to families who owe your court old debts. For the first time, something flickered across Draven's face when he looked at Mira, and this time she recognized it clearly. Not regret, not longing, something closer to disbelief that the woman he'd dismissed so easily had become, in a matter of months, the exact thing standing between him and getting away clean with an act of quiet war. You always underestimated what I paid attention to, Mira said, and her voice came out steady, almost gentle, the way you'd speak to someone you'd finally stopped being afraid of. You thought I stood behind your chair because I didn't have anywhere else to be. I stood there because I was paying attention the whole time, even when you weren't paying attention to me. Draven didn't answer that. Advisor Kell's face had gone pale beside him, which told its own story better than any denial could have. The Accord protects you from open war over this, Ronan said, but it doesn't protect you from every kingdom at that table learning exactly what kind of king funds attacks on villages full of ordinary people because his pride got wounded in a courtyard. I don't need to declare war on you, I just need to tell the truth, loudly, in the same hall where you told your own lie. The talks ended without resolution, technically, the way careful political talks often do, with no formal admission and no formal punishment. But Mira watched something settle over Draven's face as he left the Northern Wilds that day, the understanding that whatever advantage he'd hoped to gain by humiliating her in front of 5 kingdoms, he had instead handed his rival kingdom a story that would follow him for years, the king who rejected a woman strong enough to become his most dangerous enemy. Word of the confrontation spread quietly through the 5 kingdoms over the following weeks, the way important stories always do, gathering detail and weight as it traveled. The rogue attacks on the northern villages stopped almost immediately. Nobody could prove exactly why, but nobody in either kingdom particularly needed proof to understand. Mira found herself, in the months that followed, settling into the Northern Wilds in a way she'd never managed to settle into the Central Crown, even after 3 years of trying. It wasn't dramatic. It was small things. The kitchen staff greeting her by name instead of by title. Ronan seeking out her opinion before council meetings instead of after. The strange, steady comfort of a bond that was still new but already felt more honest than 3 years of waiting for something that was never going to arrive. One evening, months after the confrontation, she found Ronan on the mountain overlook behind the palace, the one place he went when he wanted quiet away from advisors and reports. She sat down beside him without asking permission, the way he'd sat down beside her at the inn all those months ago, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. "I never actually asked you," he said eventually, watching the last light fade over the mountains. "Whether you wanted this. Any of it. I claimed you in a courtyard because it was the right move, and then I spent months hoping you'd choose to stay anyway." Mira thought about the question honestly before answering, the way she'd learned to do with him, because he never let her get away with easy answers. "I didn't choose you in that courtyard," she said. "I chose to leave a place that had already decided I wasn't worth keeping, but I've chosen you every day since, in every small thing, every late night over maps, every honest answer instead of a comfortable lie. That's a different kind of choosing. I think it might be the better kind." Ronan looked at her for a long moment, and this time, the something behind his eyes wasn't calculation or strategy, or even the careful curiosity from those early weeks. It was simple and unguarded in a way she'd never once seen from Draven Cross in 3 long years. "Then I'm asking properly, this time," he said. "Not in a courtyard, not in front of 5 kingdoms, just here. Mira Voss, will you stay? Not because it's strategic, not because it's convenient, but because you actually want to. She looked out at the mountains, at the palace that had, without her quite noticing when it happened, started to feel like home, and she thought about a girl standing in a courtyard 3 years ago, dropping a bucket of water because a bond had just chosen a man who would spend 3 years teaching her to expect nothing. Yes, she said, simply, and meant it completely. Below them, the palace windows were lighting up one by one as evening staff moved through the halls, warm gold light spilling out into the cold mountain air. And for the first time since she was 19 years old, Mira Voss felt like she had finally arrived somewhere she was actually meant to be. The story of the king who rejected her before the royal court, and the rival king who claimed her before the entire kingdom, became one of those tales told at gatherings for years afterward, growing a little in the telling, the way all good stories do. But the truth of it, the part that mattered most, was simpler than any dramatic retelling could capture. It was the story of a woman who had spent years being overlooked, learning, slowly and painfully, and then finally, that being chosen by the right person mattered far less than choosing, every single day, to value herself the way she'd always deserved to be valued in the first place.